Oral questions. Question orale, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, the tragic discovery at the former residential school in Kamloops is just the first.
Covered at the former residential school is the latest tragedy in the national shame of the residential schools program. In the spirit of reconciliation and partnership, I ask the Prime Minister, will the government commit to swift action on calls to action 71 to 76 in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Oui, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to work on those requests. The discovery of the remains of more than 200 children at the former Indian residential school in Kamloops is devastating. We must recognize that residential schools were a reality and a tragedy that existed in Canada.
Of these children lost who got sent away to residential schools and never came home. We've lowered the flags to half-mast. We've also continued to work with families and communities across the country to put them at the center of the healing and the research process. We will continue to work with them. We will honour their memories.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the government is withholding troubling information regarding security breaches at Canada's top national microbiology laboratory. We don't know how scientists with ties to the Chinese military received multiple security clearances. We don't know how these scientists got approval to send virus samples to China. As the world commits to investigating the source of the coronavirus, why is this Liberal government covering things up?
Honourable Prime Minister.
On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, we believe in openness and transparency, including in matters touching on national security, which is why 6 years ago we created the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians that could study issues around national security with gathering members from all parties in this House to lean in carefully on things of high sensitivity. And that's why we encourage the National Committee on National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians to look at issues like this to make sure that we can find the answers that all Canadians need to be reassured about.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The Prime Minister's secret committee does not deprive Parliament of its ability to hold this government to account. It does not deprive Canadians of their right to know the truth after countless cover-ups by this government. 2 scientists with connections to the Wuhan Institute of Virology were marched out of our top secret lab. How did these scientists get these high security approvals? How did they get approval from this government to send virus samples to China? Why is this government keeping Canadians in the dark?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
There are many questions that need to be pursued, and that is exactly something that we've created, a National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. Now, the fact that the Conservative leader just referred to it as the Prime Minister's secret committee goes to part of the problem of why the Conservative government under Stephen Harper for 10 years refused to bring in any oversight by parliamentarians of our national security apparatuses. We all remember the real concerns about Stephen Harper and Bill C-51 and labeling terrorists in Canada. We brought forward a committee of parliamentarians that have the security clearances necessary to do this work.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, 2 scientists with ties to Chinese military were removed from our highest security lab. The Liberal government is refusing to justify those actions. How can scientists have a high security pass approved for a lab? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, these are important questions and questions that are tied to national security. I know that the members of the opposition party don't want to endanger national security, and that is why we are all taking part as a party on the all-party Committee on National Security. This is a committee that has the powers and the ability to study the most sensitive details related to national security, and there is the right place to do the research on this issue. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The Prime Minister is saying we're putting security of Canadians at risk by asking basic questions of accountability to the government. This Prime Minister is putting Canadian safety at risk with his approval of transactions to Chinese state-owned enterprises and his refusal to act on Huawei. He's putting Canada's reputation globally at risk as being the only Five Eyes ally partnering with China at a time they're taking our citizens hostage and committing cyber attacks and human rights violations. When will this Prime Minister finally take a serious approach to the risks with respect to Communist China?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we see once again that this Conservative leader and Conservative Party will never hesitate to try and score political partisan points, including on the backs of our own national security. This government takes seriously our responsibilities to keep Canadians safe. We will continue to, and that's why, among other things, we created a National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, something that Conservatives refuse to do when they are in office, that has members from all parties able to come together and lean in deeply on national security issues, and they have produced tremendous reports, including with strong representation from the Conservative Party.
The Honourable Member for Beloeil-Chambly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Arts and culture sector has expressed concerns with the initial version of the bill to amend the Broadcasting Act C-10. The Bloc Québécois initiated significant changes with regard to property and controls of companies to the new Canadian reality and the French reality. The Bloc Québécois ensured the passage of C-10 before the end of the session, but the government is in working with the Conservatives not to pass C-10. Does the Prime Minister intend to pass the Broadcasting Act this month? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the partnership we have had with a number of parties in the House, including the Bloc Québécois, in order to protect our artists and creators, content creators across the country. We recognize the new reality of the digital age, and that requires us to take means to support the cultural economy across the country. We are continuing to move forward on C-10, which will ensure protection of culture across the country. We hope to be able to pass it before the end of the session. The Honourable Member for Beloeil-Chambly. The creature needs more hope. Mr. Speaker, if the Broadcasting Act, an emergency measure for artists, Francophone artists and culture, is not passed, it will be because the government is playing a political game with the Conservatives. And this game is at the expense of artists, at the expense of creators, at the expense of cinema and TV in Quebec. Is the Prime Minister aware of the fact that if C-10 is not passed before the end of June by this House and the Senate, there will be a heavy political price to pay in Quebec and for the artists? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, this government has always demonstrated our commitment to artists and to the cultural sector. We will continue to do this. Throughout the pandemic, we have taken measures, targeted measures for the artistic sectors and artists that needed additional supports, and we have been there for them. But since the beginning of our government, we have reversed the Harper government's cuts. We have been there to protect the cultural sector. We will continue to work in order to pass C-10. It is of concern, in fact, that the Conservatives are yet again blocking Canadian and Quebec culture. We will be there to support these artists.
For Burnaby South.
Canadians are still reeling from the discovery of 215 Indigenous children at a former residential school in Kamloops. While Canadians are reeling from this horror, we can't ignore the fact that Indigenous communities continue to face injustice today. This Prime Minister is fighting Indigenous kids in court and continues to fight residential school survivors in court. As Cindy Blocksack says, we need to make sure that injustices stop today. So will the Prime Minister commit to stop fighting Indigenous kids and residential school survivors in court, yes or no?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we have been very clear on this and many other issues in regards to the work we need to do together on reconciliation. Every survivor deserves compensation. We will be there for that. We will work with them and with communities to get there. We also need to fix child and family services, and we were the first government to pass legislation to do just that. We are on the cusp of transformative change. We have been working on it over the past years. We have made many changes. There is more to do. We will continue to stand with Indigenous communities across this country as we do that.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
La découverte.
The discovery of 215 Indigenous children shocked the country. We mourn the loss of these children, but we cannot mourn the loss of these children without recognizing the fact that the Indigenous community continues to deal with and face injustices today. Does the Prime Minister commit to stop taking Indigenous children and residential school survivors to court, yes or no? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, for the past 6 years, we have been working with Indigenous communities, with survivors across the country, in order to overturn these tragedies and build a better present and future for all Indigenous peoples. With regard to compensation, we have recognized that as a government that, yes, there will be compensation for survivors of residential schools. There will be compensation. We are working on this issue with the communities in order to set the right amounts. We will continue to be there to support the Indigenous communities and individuals across the country.
For Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, last week, President Biden ordered U.S. intelligence to investigate two likely theories on the origin of the coronavirus, one being that it originated from human contact with an infected animal, and the other that it came from a lab accident at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Last weekend, the Foreign Affairs Minister said the government supports this U.S. investigation. Given that government scientists at the government's lab in Winnipeg closely collaborated with the Wuhan lab, will the government make available to U.S. investigators all relevant documents, including the scientists' lab notes?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as we have said before, the two individuals in question are no longer employed at the laboratory, and we cannot provide any further details. As to the origin of COVID-19, we believe and support the approach taken by President Biden to investigate something which has turned the world upside down and killed over 3 million people. We feel it's important to do everything we can to determine where COVID-19 originated from.
The Honourable Member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, we know that 7 government scientists at the government's National Microbiology Laboratory in Winnipeg collaborated with scientists in China, particularly at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We also know that one of those government scientists, Dr. Chu, made at least 5 trips to China in a 2-year period to collaborate on virus research. Seeing that the government says that it supports this U.S. investigation, will the Canadian government grant access to U.S. investigators to question scientists from the Winnipeg lab as they pursue the origin of the coronavirus?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for the question. I thank the member for the question, and the member knows that part of scientific research is open and collaborative research. We know also that we have a strong role to play in protecting Canada from human and cyber actors that pose real threats to Canadian research, to integrity, to intellectual property. While the opposition continues to stoke fear, we'll remain focused on stopping the spread of COVID-19, on supporting the National Microbiology Lab to do their important work in fighting COVID-19 here domestically and internationally as we uncover the science that will lead us forward.
L'Honorable.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister hopes that we'll stop asking questions about the Winnipeg lab, but the top secret information from a Canadian lab is now in the hands of the Chinese Army. The Prime Minister doesn't seem to care, but he must admit that no one believes that the People's Liberation Army intends to use this technology for humanitarian purposes. Can the Prime Minister confirm that no Canadian lab is collaborating with the Chinese military? The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
L'honorable.
The Honourable Minister.
Speaker, I apologize. I thought I heard you say the right honorable Prime Minister. Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Speaker. Either Conservatives don't understand national security or they don't care. The agency has provided documents in relationship to this situation with redactions to prevent confidentiality. Of course, I encourage the Conservative Party not to use national security and put national security of Canadians at risk for partisan gain.
L'honorable.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, on the contrary, we understand full well national security, and what we understand is that Canada had top secret information stolen. That we understand full well. But now, as to whether the President of Public Health Canada has the power and the discretion to hide information, we know that answer is no. Documents must be provided to the committee as asked. Is the Minister of Health in agreement with that or not?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said, we will participate. And in fact, those documents have been provided to the committee with redactions to protect confidentiality. But Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. I would encourage the Conservative Party not to put national security of Canadians at risk for partisan gain. They are playing a dangerous game, Mr. Speaker. The member opposite knows that we have processes and procedures, indeed committees that are empowered to take a look at these documents.
The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Well, Mr. Speaker, when the Liberals initially failed to provide these documents, it was actually the member for Cumberland-Colchester, a Liberal MP, who put forward a motion at the committee demanding the full disclosure of these documents. And all Liberals, including the Parliamentary Secretary for Foreign Affairs, voted in favour of it. In 2011, Liberals, including the Prime Minister and the Foreign Affairs Minister, voted for a motion which declared the undisputed privileges of Parliament under Canada's Constitution, including the absolute power to require the government to produce uncensored documents when requested. That is a direct quote from a Liberal opposition motion that was voted for by the Prime Minister and the Foreign Affairs Minister. Does the government still believe that Parliament maintains these privileges?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, again, we see the Conservatives trying to stoke fear. Either they don't understand national security or they don't care. It's quite obvious. The agency has provided these documents as requested by the committee with redactions to protect confidentiality. I'd encourage the Conservative Party to put the national security of Canadians in the forefront and stop these partisan games.
The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Speaker, that was clearly not an answer. But when it comes to national security, holding the government accountable for their failures on national security is what we must do in order to uphold the national security of Canadians. When someone affiliated with the Chinese Military's Academy of Military Medical Sciences is working and gathering information at a top secret Canadian lab, Canadians have a right to know what happened. They have a right to demand answers. Canadians are concerned about the government's willful blindness and naivety when it comes to threats to our health and national security. So when will the government allow Parliament to do its job, recognize the rights and privileges that are founded in our Constitution when it comes to Parliament? When will they hand over these documents?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I've been clear, those documents have been provided to the committee. In fact, the redactions were minimal to protect the confidentiality of the situation. Mr. Speaker, again, I would encourage the Conservative Party to stay focused on the national security of Canadians and not put it at risk for partisan purposes. We are proud of the critical role that the National Microbiology Lab is playing to protect Canadians and indeed to partner with researchers around the world to find the tools and the support that we need to get ourselves free of COVID-19 globally.
The Honourable Member for Pierre-Boucher, Les Patriotes Verchères. Mr. Speaker, Air Canada planes may not be able to fly because of the pandemic, but senior executives at Air Canada are definite high flyers. After having gained $6.5 billion in government assistance, execs at Air Canada behave like real gluttons in awarding themselves $20 million in bonuses. 22,000 people were laid off. And they fought not to reimburse people for canceled flights, and now they're paying themselves at our own expense. Will the government withhold the money for Air Canada until the gluttons drop the idea of getting their bonuses? The Honourable Minister.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Canadian aviation sector was hard hit by the pandemic. We are determined to support the thousands of people working in the sector. there was a measure put in place to ensure there were limits on what could be done with the money. The honourable member for Verchères-les-Patriotes, Mr. Speaker, the government offered $5.9 billion to Air Canada on the condition that executives cap their income at $1 million a year. $1 million, that's a lot when your company is depending on public funds to survive. It's a lot when you've just sentenced 22,000 families to poverty by laying off half your workforce, but the heads of Air Canada are handing out $20 million in bonuses. These people are laughing at the government. Will the government withhold Air Canada's money until the bonuses are repaid in order to ensure that Canadians do not pay a single cent, Quebecers do not pay a single cent of it? The Honourable Minister.
Merci pour la...
Thank you for the question. Mr. Speaker, I would tell you that in negotiating our support for Air Canada, we clearly established the limits of the remuneration for executives. This is an important and necessary measure. I also wish to say that Air Canada agreed to a measure that will not allow Air Canada, or rather, a measure to ensure that all workers remain in place.
Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Mr. Speaker, in 2015, when this government was elected, they committed to all 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Sections 71 to 76 are very specific about missing children burial information. Given the horrific discovery of the remains of 215 children at the Kamloops residential school, will the minister commit to full financial support, other necessary supports for a thorough investigation, not only there, but at all former residential schools in Canada?
Honourable Minister.
I thank the member for the question and all of her heartfelt agency on this. Our thoughts are with the survivors, families, and Indigenous communities across Canada. The discovery is a reminder of the harms done to residential school attendees and the trauma that survivors and families continue every day. We've supported the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation to develop the National Residential Schools Student Death Register and to create an online registry of residential school cemeteries. In Budget 2019, we are funding $33.8 million to engage with Indigenous communities on how to implement calls to action 74 to 76.
For Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Mr. Speaker, with the tragic news out of Kamloops, it is clear that many Indigenous Canadians and residential school survivors are being forced to relive their trauma. As Chief Casimir said, we see you, we love you, and we believe you. We need to ensure supports are available as they come to terms with these latest findings, as well as their own truth and trauma. In addition to the support hotline, will the minister commit to requested mental health support?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank the member for that exceedingly important question. The answer is yes, and I will take this opportunity because there isn't a single Indigenous community that has not been affected by this, to remind people that there is a crisis referral service hotline that you can access by dialing 1-866-925-4419, 866-925-4419. We have reached out, I have reached out directly to Chief Casimir and surrounding communities to ensure that they have the full support of the Government of Canada, of Indigenous Services Canada, as they go through this difficult emotional time. We will be there for them. We'll be working with First Nations Health Authority to be there for them now and for the foreseeable future.
The Honourable Member for Calgary, Midnapore.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, the aid plan for the aviation sector should not include the bonuses for executives, but we learn that Air Canada handed over more than $20 million in bonuses after having gotten $6 billion almost from the federal government. Why was the government unable to negotiate an agreement that would exclude this kind of compensation for senior executives instead of focusing on Canadian workers? The Honourable Minister.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Canadian aviation sector has been hard hit by the pandemic. We are determined to support Canadians working in the sector. The member is incorrect. The reality is that support to Air Canada has clear limits to executive remuneration. It's a necessary and appropriate measure. The honourable member for Calgary-Midnapore. I'm certain that I'm right.
Close to $2 million each, while tens of thousands of workers lost their jobs or went on government programs. I was clear in my demands in December that it was workers who were desperate for help and not executives. Why was this government incapable of negotiating an agreement that excluded executive compensation instead of focusing on Canadian workers?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me be very clear. The government absolutely believed that limits on executive compensation were a priority in our negotiations with Air Canada. And that is why the agreement that we reached with Air Canada includes clear and strict limits on executive compensation. These restrictions will be in place until 12 months after the loans have been repaid. And let me also emphasize that Air Canada has committed to maintain employment at or above April 1st levels. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, there is no interpretation.
Je vais parler en anglais.
I will speak in English.
Let me know if you can get a translation. Do you hear me in French? Non, c'est pas en français encore.
You're not getting it in French yet. There's a technical problem.
Dans la chambre, ça fonctionne.
It's working in the House, however.
Okay, everything's good then. We can hear everything translated? C'est beau? Parfait. Merci beaucoup. OK, nous allons continuer.
Je n'ai pas entendu la réponse du ministre.
OK.
Elle peut recommencer.
OK, je vais demander à la vice-première ministre de répéter sa réponse pour que tout le monde...
I will ask the Deputy Prime Minister to repeat her answer so that everybody can hear. With pleasure, Mr. Speaker.
The reality is our government absolutely agrees that it was necessary and it was a priority to include strict limits on executive compensation, including stock options, in our loan agreement with Air Canada. Those restrictions are there and they will be in place until 12 months after the loans are repaid. I want to emphasize also, since I know everyone in this House cares about workers, that Air Canada has agreed that employment levels will remain at or above April 1st levels. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for North Island Powell River.
Mr. Speaker, the bodies of 215 precious children found at a residential school, and Indigenous people are asking for justice, not words. But this government won't stop taking First Nations kids to court. A human rights tribunal found the government discriminated against First Nations kids. It is now a choice. It's time to make it right. They cannot have it both ways, offering sympathies for a mass grave while continuing to persecute children in court. When will this government make the right choice and stop fighting First Nations children?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And now is, in fact, the time to stand with the communities that are most deeply affected and support them in their time of grieving. We have said to the member's question time and time again that we will compensate First Nations children for the discrimination that they suffered at the hands of Child and Family Services. We continue on those paths. We continue to work with the 3 competing court cases to ensure fair compensation to those who have suffered harm. We will continue on the long path towards transformative change to make sure that no child is apprehended again.
The Honourable Member for Courtenay Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, Mi'kmaq fishers from the Sabaganagati First Nation have been abandoned by this government. DFO decided they can't fish now, even though this is a clear violation of their treaty rights to earn a moderate livelihood. And that's what Indigenous fishers are trying to do. Earn a living, feed their families, and in some cases, work their way out of poverty. They're also afraid of violence from non-Indigenous fishers with good reason. Their property has been burned. They've been threatened and assaulted, and the government has offered no plan to ensure their safety. This isn't reconciliation. What is the government doing to protect the rights and safety of Indigenous fishers?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have been very clear that First Nations have an absolute right to fish for a moderate livelihood. We have put in place plans this year that allow them to be able to fish for that moderate livelihood as we work towards long-term agreements. The plan that we've put in place for this year is flexible. It allows First Nations to sell their catch. It also makes sure that they are the ones who are developing their fishing plans. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to negotiate for longer-term agreements because we know how important this is to First Nations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Mississauga Lakeshore.
Palestinian civilians are suffering profound hardship as a result of the recent violence, displacement, and loss of life, and have endured unimaginable pain. All human beings are born with equal, unalienable rights. We must all work to uphold them. Canadians, including residents of my community, are expressing deep concern over these rights, the urgent need for humanitarian assistance in Gaza and the West Bank, and unfettered access to provide this assistance. Could the Minister of International Development tell this House how Canada will support Palestinians in coping with the effects of this devastating violence and work to build a foundation for lasting peace?
The Honourable Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank my colleague from Mississauga Lakeshore for his hard work on this issue. The $25 million in funding announced last week is being provided through trusted partners and will ensure that emergency relief quickly reaches Palestinian civilians whose humanitarian needs have only been worsened by this conflict. It will go beyond these urgent and immediate needs to also support recovery and rebuilding efforts. And Mr. Speaker, it will support critical peace building and people-to-people initiatives to advance the goal of a just and lasting peace in the Middle East. Thank you.
The honourable member for Carleton.
Le Canada a parmi les prix parmi les plus hauts au monde.
Canada has some of the highest prices for cell services. The Liberal government promised during the election to reduce prices by 25% and increase competition, but two decisions by the CRTC run against these promises. There's new telecommunications businesses that have decided to not pursue their plan to provide services at a lower cost. Are the Liberals still committed to reducing prices for Canadians by 25%? Yes or no? The Honourable Minister.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie mon honorable collègue pour...
Mr. Speaker, I thank my colleague. I have a great deal of respect for him. We are always trying to move in the direction of affordable pricing for Canadians throughout the country, making sure that there's more competition in telecommunications, and ensuring that we have innovation. That's why we constantly favor competition to lower prices while trying to improve quality and increase coverage. That's exactly what we've been doing since the beginning of our mandate, and we'll continue to do that every single day. Thank you.
Peter Carleton.
But among the new competitors who were planning to enter the market and offer lower prices, some are now announcing their plans are canceled. Two CRTC rulings have favored the large telecommunications giants, limited competition, and prevented a flourishing free market in the sector. That is not a recipe for lower prices. The Liberals promised a 25% reduction in prices by this coming October. They're not even close to meeting that promise. My last question was clear. I say it again. Will every Canadian get a 25% cut in cell phone prices?
The Honourable Minister.
Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, I'll tell my colleague what's the recipe for success is to be relentless in focusing on affordability, competition, innovation, and connectivity across Canada. That's why, Mr. Speaker, our government, since day one, we have been relentless in promoting competition to lower prices while working to improve quality and increase the coverage of telecom services in Canada. That's what I'm doing, Mr. Speaker. Every time I talk to executives in the telecom industry or internet service provider is to make sure that they provide affordable services to Canadians, and I will continue to do that every step of the way.
The Honourable Member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
Mr. Speaker, it is Pride Month, and still, after many years, we have seen this Liberal government fail to make a permanent refugee program for the LGBTQ+ community. Many members of the community are stoned, hung, assaulted, and many other horrific acts committed against them just for being who they are. When will this Liberal government stop the lip service and commit to a permanent program to help LGBTQ refugees?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, for the last 3 years in a row, Canada has led the world when it comes to resettling refugees. We have worked very closely with the LGBTQ2 community to ensure that members of that community are able to resettle to Canada despite the challenges that have been posed by COVID-19. Mr. Speaker, we will continue that work to uphold human rights around the world, and we will do so proudly.
I want to remind the honourable members that when setting up and they know they're either going to ask or possibly answer a question, to hook up where the ISP is solid so that everyone can hear and it doesn't damage the translator's ears. It's just a courtesy I want to remind all the members of. L'honorable député de Drummond, un rappel au règlement.
Point of order. Yes, a point of privilege. There was no French interpretation for that last answer. It got lost in the woods.
Il n'y avait pas de traduction.
There was no interpretation.
Ask the honourable minister to try answering that again. We didn't get the translation because of the quality of the sound and again, the decision is the question is on the transmission quality. I'll let him try again. Thanks.
Mr. Speaker, as I said, for the last 3 years in a row, Canada has led the world when it comes to resettling refugees.
I believe we've lost connection. We're going to move on to the next question. The honourable member for Calgary Forest Lawn.
Mr. Speaker, we hear the same old answers with no action, and let me show you how. This Liberal government has repeatedly failed to stand up for persecuted refugees. They ran away from standing up to China, who is committing genocide against Uyghur Muslims, and show no action for persecuted Hindus and Sikhs in Afghanistan. They've created a Liberal-made backlog nightmare, causing further hardships to families and minority groups. When will the platitudes end? When will this Liberal government show some fortitude and step up?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, for our government, LGBTQ2 rights are human rights. And whether that's domestically or internationally, Canada will always take a strong position. And our record demonstrates that. What's unfortunate is that the member is very bold to ask that question when just yesterday we were debating C6 in regards to protecting LGBTQ2 rights for Canadians. And what are the Conservatives doing? The Conservatives are holding up that legislation. The Bloc, the NDP, the government is ready to call the question, but who is stopping it? The Conservatives. Maybe they want to get their act together and take a position and state that LGBTQ2 rights are in fact human rights.
L'honorable député de Saint-Jean.
Monsieur le Président, le Québec veut que la loi...
Mr. Speaker, Quebec wants Bill 101 to apply to businesses under federal jurisdiction and make French the language of work. But in its white paper on language reform, the federal government says that its solution for protecting French is to impose the Official Languages Act, but it's not the same thing. Bill 101 protects French. The Official Languages Act protects bilingualism. But bilingualism is doing just fine. It's French that's doing badly. Is the government going to let Quebec protect French, or does it want to go over Quebec's head and protect bilingualism?
L'honorable ministre.
The Honourable Minister.
Monsieur le Président, il est nullement question...
Mr. Speaker, we're not going to go over Quebec's head. We're working with Quebec. That's probably what is displeasing to the Bloc Québécois. They're creating an argument or an issue where there is none. Both levels of government are working together to promote, to reinforce the language that we cherish.
L'honorable député de Saint-Jean.
Monsieur le Président, pour une rare...
Mr. Speaker, for once, Air Canada is not in first place for complaints about French to the Commissioner of Official Languages this year. Of course, no one flew this year. I mention this because Air Canada is subject to the Official Languages Act, but that doesn't stop them from not giving a hot damn about French. The federal government's strategy for protecting French is to extend the application of the Official Languages Act to all businesses under federal jurisdiction. Why not just announced that Quebec should apply Bill 101 instead of Air Canadianizing workplaces in Quebec. The Honourable Minister.
Monsieur le Président, écoutez,
Mr. Speaker, listen. The Lieutenant of Quebec is working with us, but the Bloc is looking for an argument where there isn't one. We do want to ensure for the protections for French. This is the first federal government in our history to recognize that French is a minority language in the country, and in our reform, we propose to offer protection to French as the language of service and work in Quebec, and in some communities with a high Francophone population in the rest of the country. We will act on our jurisdiction to protect French in Quebec and outside of it.
Kent, Middlesex.
Mr. Speaker, we've learned that 2 scientists, as well as students from Communist China, gained security clearance and entered into the National Microbiology Lab, had access to it. Even more disturbing is that the federal scientists are collaborating with a communist government that wants to hurt China. I know the Prime Minister has said that he admires China's basic dictatorship, but my constituents do not. Mr. Speaker, will this government commit to finally cutting ties with scientists working for China's communist regime?
Honourable Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure what that mishmash is, but let me be clear. The National Microbiology Lab is a Canadian jewel. It has provided an immense amount of support to Canadians during COVID-19 and indeed before. World-renowned science in collaboration with many other countries is conducted through the lab and through its partners. In terms of national security, clearly the Conservatives are playing a dangerous game. Either they don't understand or they don't care about national security. I would encourage them not to use the security of Canadians and put the security of Canadians at risk for partisan gain.
The Honourable Member for Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Headingley.
Mr. Speaker, Conservatives have repeatedly tried to get answers for Canadians about how a military scientist from the communist Chinese regime got access to the Level 4 National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg. This government continues to stonewall and refuses to provide answers. Recent polling has shown that over 60% of Canadians have had their trust in the federal government permanently eroded, and anyone watching as Liberal ministers continue dodging in question period can quickly see why. Canadians deserve a government that they can trust. What is the Liberal government trying to hide?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians know that this government puts their security, safety, and health at the forefront of everything we do. In fact, what Canadians don't appreciate is partisan gains with their security. And Mr. Speaker, that member opposite knows that we have provided those documents to the committee, minor redactions for the protection of confidentiality. I would encourage the Conservative Party not to put the security of Canadians at risk for partisan gain.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, home prices continue to rise beyond the affordability level for many Canadians. In my city of Edmonton, a single-family detached home increased by more than 11% year over year in the month of April. Inflation in this sector is particularly pronounced, and on top of that, we have new mortgage rules. The U.S. is doubling tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber, yet another factor in increasing the prices on homes. Mr. Speaker, when will the Prime Minister take decisive action versus hollow announcements to improve housing affordability in this country, or will he continue to ignore this massive issue?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we remain firmly committed to tackling the crucial issue of housing affordability in Canada. Our government is focused on ensuring that Canada's residential housing stock is not used unproductively by non-resident, non-Canadian investors. That's why we're proposing an annual 1% tax on the value of non-resident, non-Canadian owned residential real estate that's considered to be vacant or underused. On top of that, Budget 2021 is our 5th consecutive budget where we're investing more than ever before in affordable housing for Canadians.
L'honorable député de Châteauguay-Lacolle.
Monsieur le Président, aujourd'hui c'est...
Mr. Speaker, today is World Milk Day. And I want to thank all of our farmers. In Quebec, there's 11,000 producers on 5,000 farms producing milk, butter, cream, yogurt, and cheese, which we are so proud of. Even the ice cream that I love. In 1972, a Liberal government under Trudeau put in place supply management to protect our Canadian producers. What can the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food tell us about what our government is doing for the dairy sector?
L'honorable ministre.
The Honourable Minister.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Notre gouvernement reconnaît.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government will always protect the supply management system, and we're committed to not giving, and we are committed to paying full and fair compensation to our farmers. They already know what they're going to receive in 2023 and 2024. And compensation for the CUSMA deal will follow. We remain committed to protecting the supply management system and not giving up any more market share. Happy Milk Day. I would like to remind members that when someone refers to someone in the House, they must refer to their riding or the position that they have in the House, but not their given name. Just a little reminder. I know that sometimes we forget, but when it's part of a question, well, we'll leave it there.
Le député de Beauce.
The Honourable Member for Beauce.
Monsieur le Président, en cette journée mondiale du lait, ma question...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On this World Milk Day, my question's for the Minister of Agriculture. Over the past year, the government finally made some announcements for dairy farmers. But our dairy processors are still waiting. Negotiations for CUSMA compensation have stalled. Meanwhile, our American counterparts are already challenging us on tariff-free quotas. What will the minister do to better protect the Canadian dairy sector and what products cross our borders? And when will we see some real help for our processors? The Honourable Minister.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Alors,
thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll remind my colleague that we announced in the last budget compensation for milk, egg, and poultry processors, and I'm working with the Minister of International Trade to follow up with the Canada-Quebec Committee. We are entirely confident that tariff rate quotas will be applied correctly, according to what was negotiated very carefully with the United States. I want to assure dairy producers that we have their backs.
Honorable député de Mégantic-l'Érable.
Le gouvernement libéral qui a choisi de...
The Liberal government, which chose to create two classes of seniors in this country, also had the bright idea to create two classes of compensation for the damage done by the Phoenix system. Retirees who are entitled to compensation because of the system's failures will have to wait until after others claim their entitlements. Treasury Board has no forms for them to submit for compensation. It's been reported the forms won't be available for months. One retiree wrote that he's still up in arms because he doesn't know when he'll get his money. Why is the government treating its retirees like second-class citizens?
Honorable Ministre.
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to assure my colleague that we are working on behalf of seniors, seniors that have worked all their lives. They deserve to have a safe and financially secure retirement. They deserve to be paid their benefits and the services, benefits and the payments that they require. We're working very hard to make sure that all seniors receive the payments and the benefits that they are entitled to. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Medicine Hat, Carson Warner.
Mr. Speaker, over this past Victoria Day weekend, there were 3 people shot in Toronto, 4 shootings in Ottawa, 1 killed and 4 wounded in the Mississauga shooting. The Lower Mainland in BC has seen increased gang violence with over 20 killings so far this year. Winnipeg experienced a string of 3 shootings in just one day last month. Mr. Speaker, the Liberal soft-on-crime approach has resulted in huge gang crime increases and gang violence across this entire country. When will this government start working to protect our communities?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'd remind the member that we promised Canadians we would strengthen gun control, while his party has promised Canadians that they would weaken it. Mr. Speaker, we've given the law enforcement agencies across this country $327 million to strengthen their response to gun and gang violence. The member voted against that. We've also brought forward legislation that's identified the 3 ways in which criminals gain access to guns. Smuggling.
Encore une fois, de français.
OK, nous semblons avoir un problème de
There seems to be a translation problem.
Everything in French now, it's not being translated. Là, c'est traduit.
Now it's being translated.
I'll ask the Honourable Minister to start his answer from the top, and then we'll make sure that it all gets translated so that everyone can hear. The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question the member has asked because it gives me an opportunity to remind him that we have promised Canadians we would strengthen gun control. Well, of course, his party has promised the gun lobby they will weaken it. Mr. Speaker, we've also made significant investments of $327 million in law enforcement's ability to do gun and gang investigations, a budget measure that the member voted against. And Mr. Speaker, we continue to invest in kids and in communities, but we've also brought forward new legislation identifying the ways in which criminals gain access to guns and strong new measures to deal with the smuggling of guns, the theft of guns, and the criminal diversion of guns. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to work hard to keep Canadians safe, and I'd encourage the member to actually support those initiatives and support law enforcement's efforts to keep.
L'honorable député de Vimy.
Monsieur le Président, la pandémie a touché.
Mr. Speaker, the pandemic affected many Canadians, including young families. My constituents have had to balance work and family, and that's led to many additional expenses. Can the Minister of National Revenue tell the House what our government is doing to support families with young children during this difficult time? The Honourable Minister.
Monsieur le Président, je tiens à remercier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for Vimy for her important question. Many families have faced financial hardship during the pandemic. That's why we announced a Canada Child Allowance supplement of up to $1,200 per child under the age of 6. Last Friday, the first payment was made directly to parents. This measure will benefit 1.6 million families. This benefit helps 9 out of 10 families by giving them more money, non-taxable, indexed to inflation, lifting 435,000 children out of poverty since 2015. My message to families is clear. We will always be there to support you.
L'honorable député, the Honourable Member for Churchill, Kiwetinoong-Aski. The Honourable Member for Churchill, Kiwetinoong-Aski. Is she on? Okay. We'll go on to the next question and come back should the Honourable Member return. The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week is Environment Week in Canada, and my question to the Prime Minister is, wouldn't it be a wonderful thing if during Environment Week, the Environment Committee strengthened Bill C-12, the so-called Net Zero Climate Accountability Act? Specifically, one of my amendments that's been rejected. I would be so grateful to know from the Prime Minister why the government does not want the climate targets and climate plans to be based on the best available science. Right now, the bill says that the best available science must merely be taken into account. Surely we wouldn't take it into account when we look at COVID. We base our decisions on science.
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and yes, happy Environment Week. The best available science tells us that we must achieve net zero emissions by 2050, and certainly we are committed to meeting that target. With this legislation, we are enshrining that commitment into law. Mr. Speaker, we will be further strengthening this bill to include a number of amendments, including a 2025 review of our 2030 target, an interim emissions reduction objective for 2026, and enshrining the principle of progression of future targets. This legislation is very much a win for Canadians who expect their parliamentarians to have a real plan to fight climate change and to build a clean growth economy.